Hey Artnerds, today we're taking a look at the Spectrum Noir TriBlend marker. This is a 3-in-1 marker that I picked up while I was at Hobby Lobby because the idea of 3 markers in one is just really appealing to me. It reminds me of some of the markers that I reviewed in the early 2010s, and I look forward to checking it out with you guys today and doing a monochrome challenge with you guys and walking you through it. So I hope you guys are looking forward to it. We've looked at a few other Spectrum Noir markers on this channel, the G1, the G2, and the Spectrum Noir illustration markers. We've also looked at the Spectrum Aqua markers over on the blog, and I have a set of the Spectrum color pencils for florals. Spectrum Noir is a British company that's tried to make headway in the American art supply market with alcohol markers. The TriBlend markers seem to be a pass at the Chameleon Markers, offering 3 markers in one with the promise that they're interblendable. I picked up this individual 3-in-1 marker at Hobby Lobby. I paid $4 or $5.99 for it. We're going to see in a second because I left the price sticker on. $4.99 for it, which isn't a bad deal for 3 markers in one. And what you actually receive with this marker is 3 individual markers that interconnect kind of like a transformer to form one large, super long marker. They are all individually sold that I saw, and they were available in a selection of colors. Inside every TriBlend marker, there's a perfect gradation of 3 colors, numbered from light to dark, for a smooth, controllable blend with beautiful shades you'll return to time and time again. Now anyone can color and blend like an expert. It's easy. And as an alcohol marker artist and somebody who teaches alcohol markers, I find this concept very intriguing. Inside this marker, we're getting coral red 1, 3, and 6, so there's a 2-step division between each color. And it says that blending instructions are included. Now, since I'm pretty familiar with alcohol markers, I decided not to bother with the blending instructions, but you'll find them inside the package as well as online. Now, there's a lot of package for each individual marker. That's probably to ensure that these don't walk when they're being sold in stores. And although there's a serrated edge at the back that you just rip open, I actually kind of struggled with that a bit. So I picked this up at Hobby Lobby in Louisiana, and I saw about a dozen different color options. I never really used my Spectrum Noir G1, G2, or illustration markers, so I donated them to Goodwill so someone else might benefit. So I won't be able to do a side-by-side comparison using those markers. I am able to compare them to Copic, Prismacolor, and Chameleon markers though. The full transcript for this video will be available down in the description below. So if you're having trouble following along with what I'm saying, you can check out the description for that, as well as links to other useful reviews and products. So on the marker itself, we have the 3 divisions. Each have a color collar. So at the top, we have our CR1, and that indicates color coral blend. On the back we have our CR6, and then in the middle we have our CR3. The body screening says TriBlend by Spectrum Noir, and I actually find these markers incredibly hard to open. That's one of my big problems with these that you guys are going to hear a lot more about later on. Each individual marker is actually pretty small, as you guys can see here, and I don't think it's necessarily designed to be used in this iteration, but it can get quite fiddly. We have 2 caps, neither cap posts, and they will post on either end regardless of whether it's the correct end or not. These don't seem to be refillable, although I know that Spectrum Noir markers are refillable, so perhaps you could buy refills for them. And they do seem to only be available in the bullet nibs at this time, which is kind of disappointing because bullet nibs are my least favorite nibs for alcohol markers. So here we have the Spectrum TriBlend with the Spectrum Aqua marker, and the Spectrum Aqua marker is kind of indicative of the Spectrum Noir markers in general. They all tend to be hexagonal in shape with color chips at the end. The Spectrum Noir markers have color families rather than just color names, and the Spectrum Noir TriBlend has the color family on it as well as the individual color numbers to indicate what colors you're getting. I feel like this marker was designed to be used in conjunction with your Spectrum Noir markers, or perhaps as a way to ease new marker users into using alcohol markers. I do appreciate that Spectrum Noir is thinking about this beginner user base and trying to accommodate their needs. So with the Spectrum Noir G2 markers, the Generation 2 markers, they had replaceable brush nibs, and I took advantage of that. You guys will see in the links below. I have a full review of those. And they also had rubber grippies on the cap that made removing the caps much more easy. The TriBlend marker has no such grippies anywhere on the marker, and it's quite smooth and very difficult to remove each end. The TriBlends are longer than the original Spectrum Noir markers, but around the same girth. They lack the rubber grippies that aided in cap removal. And as I said, the caps are quite difficult to remove, and these are a bit unwieldy. They're too long to be comfortable as a single unit, and too small as individual units to be comfortable in the hand. Fully uncapped, the double-ended side is just slightly shorter than the Spectrum Aqua. And these remind me of the Letraset tri-tip markers and the tri-art markers, but a totally different approach. 3 colors in one rather than 3 tips in one. Alright, so next we're going to be comparing these to a few of the other alcohol markers on the market, the Chameleon markers, the Copic Sketch, Prismacolor, and Copic Ciao markers. So we're going to start with the Chameleon markers. I have reviews of these here on this channel. I kind of struggle to use them, but some artists really like them. And the way these work is these are twin tip markers, so you have a brush and a bullet tip. And then you have a blending chamber that puts colorless blender into your marker. So you will be able to seamlessly transition from a very, very light tone of the color to the full saturation of the color. Chameleon also makes the Chameleon color tops, and these work rather than using the colorless blender chamber. You put this on and it will put that color in, and you can get these really nice ombre transitions. So those do the color blending in the marker itself, so you're going to get a really seamless transition. With the new TriBlend markers, you do the blending on the paper, which definitely allows you to customize how much blending you're getting and where your transitions begin and end, but the transitions are not going to be as seamless. So the Chameleon is one color with a blender built in. You're going to have to work from light to dark, and the blended out shade is going to be your full saturation. There's also the Chameleon caps, which allow you to create an ombre color from one to the other, and they're designed to give smooth transitions utilizing tip-to-tip blending. Next, we have the Copic Sketch. Usually when I do these marker reviews, I compare everything to the Copic Sketch because that's what people are the most familiar with. Copic has the largest color family colors available of any of these markers. I think it's like 120 in the Sketch and 300 in the original. And like with the Prismacolor and the Copic Ciao below it, these are all single color markers. So if you want to blend these colors out or add other colors, you're going to need additional markers. And really, these are just 3 different ways of thinking about color blending and how you approach your color collection. So we have everything uncapped here. I promise this is a still photo. I know watching me leave my markers uncapped makes you guys really uncomfortable. I understand that, but it's useful for seeing how the markers compare. So you guys can see that the TriBlend is the girthiest. It is the largest around, so it may be difficult for people who struggle with larger markers like Prismacolors. And it's also one of the longest. It's only a little bit shorter than the Chameleon color top. Unfortunately, you can't just reduce the length by removing sections because those markers, the colors that you have removed, will begin to dry out immediately. So most of the markers in this selection have a brush tip and a chisel tip, but a few have a brush tip and a bullet nib. The Spectrum Noir is the only example with all bullet nibs, and it's the first time I've ever encountered an alcohol marker that only offers a bullet nib. Capping and uncapping for most of these markers is fairly simple, and most of these markers have the color name and color family designated on the top with a color chip. The only exception to that is the TriBlend, which only has 2 caps rather than 3, and it doesn't actually indicate the individual colors, it indicates the blend, and the Copic Ciao, which is just a color chip cap. And you see uncapped the relative sizes of each individual marker. Completely uncapped, the Chameleon is actually the smallest marker. And And recapping is a little bit of a struggle. The chameleons cap together fairly simply, but there's so much going on that they can be a bit unwieldy. The TriBlends are a little bit harder to cap, so if you have arthritis problems, this might be a struggle for you. The Copic Sketch caps snap on quickly and easily, no real struggle. The Prismacolor caps snap on the same way, very easily. And then the Copic Ciaos are a little bit flimsy. Those are the cheapest of the Copic offerings. So it may not necessarily feel as secure as you like, but it's a pretty secure capping. Honestly, I really like the Copic Ciao, and even though they have a smaller color family than the Copic Sketch, if they had come out when I was first buying markers, I would have purchased Ciaos instead of Sketches. So next we're going to do our swatch comparisons. Starting with the Chameleon, we're going to do just the color, and then we're going to do some color blending out. So we're going to use the colorless blender cap, and I'm counting to 15 here, even though this has been time-lapse for speed purposes. The longer you hold the blender cap onto the Chameleon marker, the longer your transition is going to take. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the color cap so you guys can kind of see how that works. I do have videos on this channel where I use chameleons and chameleon color caps. If you guys are interested in learning more about those, I'll have those linked down in the description below. So you guys can kind of see how the chameleons are a bit unwieldy. They're definitely long alcohol markers, and if you're used to how traditional alcohol markers layer and blend, the chameleons are going to be a very steep learning curve. So there is our perfect blend right there. For me personally, I don't care so much about perfect blends. I know how to blend alcohol markers. I care about ease of use, portability, and whether or not these are markers I'm going to grab again and again. So the Tri markers, we're going to swatch the individual colors for you guys to see. Now, all of them go down more fluorescent than they actually are. They dry a little bit more sober, and I really like the colors. It's a really nice sort of rose, antique rose coral blend. That's one of my favorite colors. And I grabbed this marker in particular so that I could do a monochrome test that you guys are going to see at the end. So here is the blend test where we're blending out the three colors. I would say if Spectrum had gone with a brush tip, even a very small brush tip like what the chameleons have, it would be so much easier to blend because brush tips put down more ink, and having a surplus of ink is going to help with blending. So the blend transition isn't as smooth as the chameleon color top, but that makes sense. The transition occurs in the marker with the chameleon, and it occurs on the paper with the Spectrum Noir TriBlend. Bullet tip markers are a bit tedious to use, but I get that Spectrum Noir is introducing these for people who are very new to markers and might feel intimidated with a larger brush like the optional replacement for the G2. So then we swatch both ends of the Sketch, the Ciao, and the Prismacolor. Now we're going to do some blender tests, and this helps us figure out compatibility. So for this test, we're using the Copic Sketch, we're using the Blick Studio, and we're using rubbing alcohol. I did not pick up or save any of the Spectrum Noir blenders, so unfortunately I can't test that out, but I do feel like the Copic Sketch, the Blick Studio brush, and the rubbing alcohol will give us a good idea of just how compatible these are with other markers. So I'm putting down large swaths of color with each of the three colors in our TriBlend. So our CR1, our CR3, and our CR6. And I'm doing this in the Master's Touch Mixed Media Sketchbook. Normally I do my marker tests in a Strathmore Mixed Media Sketchbook. So we're starting with our Copic Sketch blender for all three colors. You can already see it's starting to react a little bit, push the color back a bit. Then we have the Blick Studio brush solvent. And then finally I'm going to drip just a little bit of rubbing alcohol. The TriBlend seems to run a bit dry. It could be that it's the bullet tip, or it could be the paper that I'm using. These tend to have ink flow issues, especially on thirsty papers like mixed media papers. And all three seem to react quite well to the solvents. So I'm going to do a layering test here, just so we can see how the colors sit on top of each other without blending them back and forth. And And as I've said in some of my Copic marker tutorials, you get about 3 tones of each color. So really you have about 9 different tones that are capable out of these markers. And this is particularly true on thirsty papers like mixed media papers. Speaking of, if you guys are interested in learning how to use alcohol markers, I have loads of great marker tutorials here on this channel. I have an alcohol marker playlist that I'll link down in the description below, and I'll also link a few of my favorites. If you're interested in learning how to use alcohol markers, consider subscribing to my channel because I have lots more tutorials coming up in the near future. I also, on occasion, review new alcohol markers. It used to be more of a thing on this channel, but I'm kind of trying to move away from that and do more tutorials instead. But if you're interested in learning about what's new and coming out with art supplies, this is a great place to check out. Okay, so we have tested out our markers. It's now time to begin our field test. This was sketched in the Master's Touch Mixed Media Sketchbook using Color Eno Pink Lead. And I do apologize that my hair is going to be in a lot of these shots. I was leaning over to see what I'm doing. Now we only have 3 colors to work with, and I also introduced my Copic blender so that we could kind of lighten and soften some of the colors that we have here. So I'm starting with the lightest color, CR1, which makes a really nice, super light skin tone. I would be interested in seeing if Spectrum Noir also has a perfect blend or a tri-blend for some darker skin tones. That would be really, really, really helpful for a lot of people. So if they don't have that, I hope it's something that they'll consider in the near future. And I'm using CR1 as my lightest tone and trying to blend it out using the colorless blender. I also have a lot of drawing tutorials on this channel and over on my blog, natosoup.blogspot.com. So if you're interested in learning how to draw or improving your drawing skills, consider sticking around, checking those out. I teach a lot of that here. I also have an art-centric Discord where we all cheer one another on, support one another, and we do daily drawing challenges and monthly drawing challenges. So if you're looking to up your art game, that could be a great place for you. I also want you guys to keep in mind none of these products are sent to me, and when products are sent to me, I always disclose it very early on in the video and in the description below. But most of the products reviewed on this channel are purchased out of pocket and reviewed because I'm interested in reviewing them. So if you want to support what I do, if you want to help me continue to do what I'm doing here on this channel, please consider joining me over at patreon.com/natosoup. And if you enjoyed just this video and you just want to do a one-time tip, you can join me over at coffee at ko-fi.com/natosoup. So for the flowers, I'm introducing a few other colors. We're using the medium color CR3. I'm blending it out with colorless blender immediately, applying another layer of CR3, and then while that's still wet, I'm applying our darkest color, CR6. And this allows us to get a softer blend. Now I want to point out that blending with bullet tip markers like these is much more difficult than blending with brush tips. You're going to see the individual strokes. They're going to be much more apparent, and it's going to be harder to blend because you're not getting as much ink onto the paper. So the caps on the lightest color, or the cap on the lightest color from here, CR1, is a real struggle to remove, and it's very frustrating. I tried to record myself removing it a few times so you guys could see just how difficult it is. That's going to be a real issue for people who have grip issues or who have arthritis issues. And I know that Spectrum Noir markets itself to crafters more so than to, say, fine artists or comic artists like myself. So I know that the audience base tends to be a little bit older, and I know these grip issues are going to be a problem for their audience. So that's something they're going to want to reconsider. The bullet nibs are a bit harder to use and take longer to color as they carry less ink and cover less area. Messing around with the caps also gets really frustrating. These would be a real issue, like I said, for somebody with grip problems or dexterity issues. The bullet nibs also started to tear up my paper, especially if you're applying color wet into wet like we're doing here. And these can be a challenge to blend because there's just not enough juice in the markers. I also fear that these markers are going to run dry really quickly because there's just not a lot of wick. There's not a lot of marker there. So I'm curious to know as to whether or not Spectrum Noir is going to sell refill kits for this. Like I said, I know they do sell refills for their markers, but I've never seen them in an actual physical store. I've never seen them at Joann's. I've never seen them at Michael's. I've never seen them at Hobby Lobby. So people who don't know to go to the Spectrum Noir website to order these or to order them on Amazon might not realize that there are refills available. So I'm utilizing the same technique for all of my little rose blossoms. And it just requires a bit of patience. So I did her skin first. I did the blush on her skin. Now I'm working on the bodice of her dress. Basically what I wanted to do was establish kind of my most important tones, her skin being one of the most important tones and the roses being one of the most important tones. And then I'm just kind of working around that. When you're working in monochrome like we're doing here, it's all about contrast and developing forms with contrast because you can't rely on color to carry your information. So we started with CR3, the middle tone, and I applied a full layer, leaving the edges white so I can blend that out. Now I'm going in with the CR6, and you can see how kind of scrubby the bullet tips get when you're trying to color a larger area. I blended out the CR6 using the CR3. Now I'm going into the other side of the dress, and I wanted her dress to look like rose petals. I think I was pretty successful in accomplishing that. Blending out our CR3 using the colorless blender so we get it closer to white, applying another layer of CR3, and then immediately putting our CR6 into it. Again, using bullet tips on such a large area, what I want is a softer blended transition by blending wet into wet, and what's happening is it's drying out before I finish applying it. So Kara has fairly dark hair, so I'm starting with the lightest color, our CR1 that we use for the skin tone. I'm going to allow that to dry, and then I'm applying our CR6, our darkest color, to her hair. And I won't lie, I actually really love the color palette that Spectrum selected for this. I would be open to trying more of the Spectrum TriBlends just because in a lot of ways this makes it very easy and very portable to do marker work, especially if you're willing to do monochromatic or limited color pieces. For the leaves, I'm using CR1, and I'm leaving a lot of the white of the paper visible. I'm also using that for the little petals, or sepals, I guess, on the sides of her dress. And then for the stems, the rose thorns, I'm using CR6. So as I mentioned earlier, doing monochromatic work is all about building up contrast. I do apologize that my hair got in the shot. It's definitely time for a haircut. It's a bit longer and a little bit more flippy than I thought because I didn't think it would be in the shot. So I'm going over my established color now that it's had a chance to dry with CR6 again. Remember what I said earlier in the video that each marker color has about 3 different tones to it. You can get 3 shades or 3 distinct shades by building up your color. And I really like how we have kind of a soft antique look to this illustration. Part of me kind of wishes I'd left it as is. So that might be something to keep in mind if you're recreating this at home, if you're doing your own. And I'm just going in and adding another layer with our lightest color. So another problem is these caps don't post. And post means that the caps kind of click on top of one another so you don't have to hold them the whole time. So now I'm inking, and I wanted to ink with kind of a sepia tone since this has sort of an antique feel. And none of the brush markers I had were really quite the right color. So I ended up switching between a couple of different ones. And I don't know if it's the paper itself, it's something that the markers scratched up the paper, or if it's the pens I'm inking with. But, and hopefully you guys can't see it, I had a lot of bleeding problems with my brush pens on this paper. Now, when I did the Master's Touch marker review, I did those markers on this same paper using the same underdrawing pencil, the color Eno in pink, and I inked it with a black Pigma FB. and I didn't have any bleeding problems, so I'm thinking it's either the bullet nibs kind of scratched up and chewed up the paper surface, or since I'm using a water-based ink instead of a pigment-based ink, we're going to have more bleeding problems as it seeps into this more textured paper. As I mentioned earlier, I kind of wish I hadn't inked this piece just because it was so beautiful uninked and so soft, but I'm inking this to add a little bit more definition, to add a little bit more contrast. Ideally, I would have inked it with a very, very dark rose pink, and that would have been just really beautiful with this. But since I don't really, all the pinks I have in terms of brush pens are very neon-y, very bright kind of pinks, so I thought a sepia brown would be a better choice in this instance. But you guys can see if you build up your contrast enough and if you utilize your 3 colors well enough, you really don't have to ink it. It's still going to be easy to tell one area from another, and it's still going to be easy to tell what's going on in the piece. So after I finished inking, I decided to add a little bit of white gouache. And for those of you who don't know, gouache is just a thick, opaque white watercolor. So I'm using titanium white from Winsor & Newton. If I hadn't inked this piece, I wouldn't need to add the gouache, but because I had those bleeding issues with the ink, I decided to use the white gouache just to add some white highlights back in and tighten up my line art just a bit. So this step is absolutely not necessary. The markers themselves with the white of the paper really gave me enough of a range of color and enough contrast, but I just wanted to show you guys this as an option for cleaning things up if maybe your color gets away from you, or you went too dark, or your inks kind of got away from you, as they kind of got away from me here. So that about wraps it up with my Spectrum Noir TriBlend review. I really like the concept of this marker. I think it's a neat idea. I'm happy that Spectrum Noir is introducing something to make marker work easier for people, and I think the price point is pretty good. $4.99 at Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby tends to be overpriced, so I imagine I could find them cheaper elsewhere. But even $4.99 for 3 markers is a pretty good deal, and the colors selected, at least in the coral blend, work really, really well together. So I'm pretty happy with this. I'd like to see Spectrum Noir work on a few things. The caps are really hard to remove. If you have arthritis or dexterity problems, this is going to be a big issue for you. I'd like to see them reintroduce the rubber grips back into them. The pins are kind of unwieldy and long. I can't necessarily see them doing something that would maintain the usage that wouldn't ruin that. So I don't necessarily expect them to do anything with that. And I'd love to see them offer a small brush tip option or a large brush tip option, although I know that brush tips might make these a little more intimidating for people who are new to markers. So I like them. I think they're fun. If you're new to markers, these could be a good way to kind of dip your toe into the water and get a really easy to use product. So I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this useful, helpful, and inspiring. I really enjoyed the piece that I created with this, and I think I'm going to be using these markers in the future. So have a wonderful day, guys. Bye!